Welcome to this first shipper update of a Tuesday morning. I'm here with Tony Mulvey, filling in for the other Tony, Anthony Smith, on this Tuesday. So Tony, what do we got, man?
So we're going to talk retail sales. So we've talked a lot about this freight rally over the past 2 years being really consumer driven. What you see, so we've got retail sales here going back from 2017 through the most recent month in March. We have a regression line. We see it's up and to the right? I mean, as expected, kind of, we're always spending more money, right? But you look at 2020, you see that big dip off related to COVID, right? And then we recover, and then around March of last year, stimulus package comes out. We see a really big uptick in that spending. We've been on this kind of similar upward movement, kind of similar to what this regression line was. And then we saw a spike right around the holidays, but then we've kind of flattened out, right? So now we're up 0.5% month over month. But the important part to remember about that 0.5, it's not adjusted for inflation, right? So we're up, inflation was up 1.2% month over month. This up 0.5. Real retail sales down 0.7% month over month. So definitely seeing some slowing in the economy, especially when you factor in that gasoline sales or factor into this, and they were up like 38 or like 8% month over month and 38% year over year. So I mean, you're definitely seeing the consumers start to hit the brakes just a little. Obviously still spending on their necessities. I mean, you look at food, shelter, and gasoline, three things that are pretty important. They're still spending money there, but they're going to cut back on other things, which are what they've been spending money on, right? That discretionary income is a lot less.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the big takeaway here for me. Like, we've been seeing this huge just snowball of retail spending. A lot of consumer demand, a lot of consumer goods. I think a lot of what we saw last year, we kind of anticipated what we're seeing right now to happen last year. Kind of a change over to services spending, other things where they're traveling, and now we have the added impact of inflationary prices of gas. That's also contributing to that number right there. I mean, if you look at the retail price of diesel, all of that really, I mean, it was inflating before, but it really took off in March. So that line probably should look more like a downward trend than an upward one, even though, because we have so much historic inflation built into it, right?
Exactly. And really, I mean, we'll move on to the next chart and we'll talk about the CPI, that consumer price index. I mean, we have a regression line going back about the same time frame, and look at the upward movement just in the past few months, right? We've really broken away from that line. So I mean, that kind of, I mean, we were well below it in 2020, but I mean, when people aren't spending money, I mean, you look at the impacts of gasoline, I mean, prices, we're talking $1.80 or less, right? And now it's national average is like $4, right? So I mean, that's a lot of where that's coming. You talked about diesel. Those prices have been really sticky, right? It's not like we saw this surge and then a collapse, right? They've come up and they've stayed there, which I think is probably the more concerning part, right? Especially, I know we've talked about carrier, especially on the small side, carriers are a lot more subject to those, smaller carriers subject to those rising diesel prices, especially at the pump. Well, if it stays there, it's not just this little blip on the radar, right? It really does start to feed in. Guess what? Shippers right now, that capacity, they're able to find it, right? They haven't been able to find it for 2 years, so now it's a lot easier. I mean, we talked about the rejections in the first carrier update, down under 10%. Well, previously, pre-pandemic, you'd think that 7 to 10% is really tight, and it's inflationary for spot rates. Guess what? Right now, it's not. And I mean, some of this pricing is going to really, or this pricing pressure, right, on the consumer is really going to impact their spending habits as we move into the summer, where everything's kind of reopened, right? Now they don't have to spend money on goods.
Yeah, I think that's the big point here, is that we're seeing this erosion of goods demand, not just in the way that people have already spent their money, and we're seeing kind of some of those underlying reasons why they were buying all these goods. Housing purchases starting to slow down, housing starts starting to slow down, mortgage rates, of course, over 5% for the first time in a while as well. So a lot of things going on here to really put a strong headwind in front of the consumer in terms of their overall spending. Inflation is just one of those of many. I think Anthony Smith actually talked about one of the only things the consumer has going for it, and they did a survey in the Wall Street Journal recently that said 27% of the economists think the wage increases are one of the biggest threats to inflation. And I'm like, well, that's necessary to kind of combat the inflation that's going on because of things like gas and all this restricted supply of other goods and things like that. I mean, it's really an interesting dynamic here. Well, Tony, thank you so much for that. We will come back to you a little bit later in the show, but first we'll toss it over to Mike Vincent, who will have our next segment.